All right, I think we're about ready to get started. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. You are here for our presentation today of Cutting Transportation Emissions, Lessons from California and Colorado. So before we get started, we are very happy today to welcome Rebecca White from the Colorado Department of Transportation and Eric Sundquist from the California Department of Transportation. I am Chris McCahill. I'm the Managing Director for the State Smart Transportation Initiative. So for those of you who are new to SSTI, we are a network for reform-oriented state DOTs, jointly operated by the University of Wisconsin and Smart Growth America. We operate in three main ways. First, as a community of practice for leaders of state DOTs. Second, as a provider of technical assistance, where we work a lot hand in hand with state DOTs. And finally, as a source of knowledge sharing. So we try and provide the public with informational materials, the latest research, and webinars like this one today. So thanks again for joining us, and we're looking forward to today's talk. This webinar today, talking with California and Colorado, grew mainly out of a series of workshops and technical assistance projects that we've been doing with states all across the US who are wrestling with questions about how they can tackle some of their clean energy and climate goals through policy and practice changes. A lot of those workshops were geared towards states learning from each other, what other folks are doing. And there was a lot of great conversations there that we wanted to share some of what we heard for other folks, for all of you today. And so that's what brings us here. Before we launch into that, I'd just like to make sure that we recognize a lot of our funders who have been behind a lot of the work we've been doing with states lately, the Barr Foundation, NRDC, the US Climate Alliance, and also remind folks that if there are any APA folks looking for AICP credits, you can head to the link in the chat. And today is eligible for 1 credit. So just a little bit of background before I hand things over to our guest today. This question of tackling transportation emissions is kind of new territory for state DOTs. The 2 states you're hearing from today and a couple others are really sort of charting the course in what it takes to sort of turn the needle on transportation emissions. There's been a sort of conventional thinking on environmental impact, that if we can make modest fuel economy improvements to vehicles and sort of tackle congestion, so there's not a lot of idling, that's really going to be, that's really what's going to address our environmental concerns. It's becoming more and more clear that that we're really not making progress when we look at things just through that single lens. You can see here a chart of transportation emissions in the US. Just in the last few years, transportation has overtaken any other sector in terms of transportation emissions. Up until at least last year, or 2020, transportation was on an upward trajectory, unlike most other sectors. And that's really because we haven't really thought enough about rising vehicle miles traveled and people just needing to drive more and more for their everyday needs. So as many gains as we make in fuel economy improvements, a lot of that's being offset by folks just needing to drive more and more. So as states are starting to think about tackling meeting their environmental goals, really they're taking a 2-pronged approach. One is through electrification and clean vehicles. That's really promising, and it seems to be a lot of momentum building in that area lately. But that's really largely outside of DOT's controls for the most part. We don't want to just narrowly focus on one solution when it's going to take a really comprehensive approach to meet those goals. So the second focus is really in shifting transportation investments. That means increasing multimodal options so people don't have to drive everywhere. And even thinking about how sort of traditional highway investments have influenced travel decision and development patterns, and rethinking some of those priorities. So we're hearing from 2 states today, Colorado, which has a new rule that says plans and programs should stay within some predefined greenhouse gas thresholds. And so the DOT there is starting to think through what that looks like for the agency. And actually they've been, sort of leading the thinking on that rule from the get-go. And California, which has SB 43, which is a rule that requires both development projects and transportation investments to limit or mitigate new vehicle miles traveled. So both of these efforts require a bunch of new internal policies, new procedures, new tools in order to be able to estimate project impacts and know that folks are staying within targets. So a lot of nuts and bolts going on behind the scene. And so, that's what we spend a lot of time talking through with the folks who got with us today. So in just a second, you're going to hear from each state, probably about 15 or 20 minutes, and that will lead up to a Q&A period at the end. So if you have any questions as our speakers are talking, go ahead and drop them in the question and answer box. We'll keep track of those and get to them at the end. So with that, I think I will stop sharing my screen and hand things over to our first speaker, Rebecca White.
All right. Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I'm really pleased to have this opportunity to talk about a policy we've been spending quite a few months and years developing, and we've got a long road ahead of us, but this is a really good juncture to fill you in on what Colorado is doing. Chris, can you see my presentation? All right. Well, one thing I appreciated about Chris's introduction was, I think he used the word wrestling at one point, in terms of many of the states are sort of wrestling with the challenge of addressing greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, and that certainly is the case in Colorado. I will talk you through some of the context in our state, but I think it's much the same across the nation, where transportation for various reasons has moved to be the predominant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. And while we know electric vehicles are out there and will probably largely solve a lot of the problem in a 20 to 30 year time frame, there's a lot of years in between. And that's very much the space that Colorado is in. Let me see if I can advance here. Can you see the next slide? It's not popping up for me. All right. So as Chris mentioned, this is a brand new rule for Colorado. We just had our governor appointed Transportation Commission, that's our oversight body, adopted this rule at the very end of the last calendar year, which was a great holiday present for our staff. And you can see there just the sort of mission statement that we've used to talk about what this rule will accomplish. Really important for how we message this within the state is it's not just about greenhouse gas emissions, it's about tackling smog. We're sort of going to that term for some longstanding ozone problems that we have across the Front Range in Colorado. But most importantly, I would point your attention here to providing more travel options for Coloradans. So we've really talked about how the onus of this rule is on CDOT and the metropolitan planning organizations to provide more choices for people in how they travel. So it's not a punitive rule on individuals. It's not taking away car keys. It's putting the obligation on us and government to do a better job of making sure there's more choices out there. A pie chart that I'm sure is familiar to a lot of folks, but as I mentioned in Colorado, like almost every state, probably transportation is our number one source. We have had some success in reducing per capita VMT at least. So that has been somewhat of a positive trend, but we are a rapidly growing state. I think we grew about 40% over the last 20 years, and the projection for the next 20 years is much the same. So while transportation is going up, the main driver here is actually that transportation has moved to the front because our electricity sector has gotten so much cleaner as we've really transitioned in the state from coal over to natural gas and renewables. So it's just put much more of a spotlight on transportation sort of hanging out there as the major source of greenhouse gas emissions. Which sort of leads me to how we got to this point in Colorado. And there were a few things that happened, and really it started at least in a big way in 2019 with the passage of a bill called House Bill 1261. Was a measure that set overall statewide CO2 or carbon reduction targets, and you'll see them there, but to get to 90% reduction for the state by 2050. That legislation then led to a document that we've called the Colorado Greenhouse Gas Roadmap, which all of the agencies sort of involved in this work, we came together and wrote this document, which was really to explain how we would reach those targets through a combination of all the tools that we have, voluntary measures, regulatory measures, and that roadmap was broken into each sector across the economy. So it listed a whole series of transportation measures. And one of the ideas that we put in there was this concept of applying a greenhouse gas standard on transportation plans. Fast forward to 2021, in our last legislative session, we, for the first time in a long time, finally got a transportation funding bill in Colorado. We had been one of the states that hadn't seen an increase in a long time, really since 2009. So that was the passage of Senate Bill 260. It raised a lot of transportation revenue, but as part of that, it included a number of environmental provisions. And one of those was to require CDOT to essentially implement the greenhouse gas planning standard. So we not only had a sort of promise in the roadmap, but we had a legislative requirement to do this, which I would say has been very helpful. And then the last piece I'll just note at the bottom of the slide, the whole basis for this thinking is very similar to how we approach air quality conformity, as many on this webinar know. It's the same concept, the same way that we are tackling ozone. And so we are borrowing a lot of that same thinking and modeling that really has been in place for a long time. So our role in particular, it is focused on transportation plans, and I'll walk you through that. Our metric is greenhouse gas emissions. We are not tracking necessarily VMT, and there was actually a lot of dialogue in Colorado around that. VMT is a bit more of a sensitive issue, so this is really focused just on greenhouse gas emissions. As I've mentioned earlier, the onus is on CDOT and our 5 metropolitan planning organizations. And sort of an important distinction in how we talked about this publicly is that we're not focusing on aviation or off-road vehicles or even the trucking sector. This is really about providing choice for individuals and getting at the contribution of passenger cars, which is the major source of greenhouse gas emissions within the transportation sector. Here's a list of our 5 metropolitan planning organizations that we folded into this rule with us. And actually the next slide here, just to give you a sense of our geography, we're a very square state, but if you follow that sort of line of MPOs, that's essentially our I-25 corridor, where the majority of our population and the majority of our traffic is. So those are the 4 MPOs that are under the standard. And then Grand Junction out on the western slope is the 5th. Not all of these metropolitan planning organizations kind of come with the same sort of background and skill set in this work. So we have established this regulation so it impacts, first of all, the MPOs that are actually in our ozone non-attainment area because they've had this practice of working in conformity. So the Denver Regional Council of Governments and the North Front Range have to meet the standard first, along with CDOT. And then we give the other 3, which include Colorado Springs, Pueblo, and Grand Junction, a few more years to come into compliance, which also gives them more time to build their modeling capability, which I'd say is kind of one of the major things that we have to work on in the coming years, is to get everyone up to a certain capability in terms of modeling, because it's so important to this rule. So the requirement itself is set across 4 time periods. We largely aligned these years with the goals within that House Bill 1261. So again, if you'll recall, overall, we want to get to a 90% reduction in 2050. So we aligned these kind of stair step of GHG reductions with those years. And interestingly, it's common sense when you think about it, but you'll see that we actually lower the standard over time, which is much different than most environmental standards where you tighten them over time. But because we expect more and more electric vehicles to come into the fleet, and hopefully we're all an all-electric state by 2050, that means that we can sort of take our foot off the gas pedal, to use a transportation metaphor, and allow, because honestly, we just get less reductions from VMT related measures over time. So we start out with a stricter standard, and by 2050, there's less of a requirement. You see here, this is just a table of numbers, but just to show you that we do have a standard, a specific reduction level for every MPO across each of these time periods, with again, those 3 more rural areas getting a bit more time before they have to meet the standard. CDOT covers the non-MPO area. So our obligation is actually on the rural parts of the state, which I think was the right move for us to make, that it eliminated any concern about overlap. But most folks will know it's a little harder to make reductions in rural parts of the state. And then the bottom there are the total greenhouse gas reductions we're achieving. And I wanted to give some context to this number. So if you look at that 2030 column at the very bottom, you see that the standard we're trying to achieve there across all the plans is 1.5 million metric tons. Here's the bigger picture for Colorado. Overall, we want to be reducing 12.7 million tons by 2030. So this is a slice of the pie. It is a very important one, but it's not seeking, nor can it achieve every reduction from the sector that we need to see. And this is a sort of a good slide to outline how we hope to reach that 12.7 million tons. But it's going to take a lot of effort across all different agencies and different sectors. So the construct here, as I mentioned at the beginning, it's very much like transportation conformity, where CDOT will use our travel demand model to forecast emissions if we were to fully build our 10-year plan. So that is the name of our formative transportation planning document. It lists projects out for an entire 10-year period. And so we will model that plan compared to the baseline of what we have in place today and what we update it to. And we will look at the emissions resulting from that over those compliance years. The MPOs have the same objective. They have longer plans. Their plans go out usually to 2045 or 2050, but they will do the same thing, take all the projects in their plan, run it through a model, and compare it against that reduction table. Now, we have a pretty sophisticated model at CDOT. We've been spending many years building an activity-based model. Only one of our MPOs actually has a model of that same level. So you'll note here, I'll talk at the end about one of our challenges going forward is to make sure that we can build that capability. But we feel very confident in our ability to do this, and it's been part of our outreach on the rule to sort of reduce the barriers and the questions around modeling and convince folks that this is a good way to look into the future. In fact, it's our best way to do this, and we'll know if we're making a difference and can meet these standards. So an important part of any regulation is to determine what happens if you can't meet it. And so we've thought through that quite a bit, and I'll talk you through several outcomes here. But one, we have written in an option to commit to mitigation measures. So this is a pathway if, say, CDOT or an MPO runs, models their plan, comes up short of the reduction target. If they can either remodel and look at different projects within their plan and try to get there, and or choose to commit to certain mitigations. This is one of our challenges going forward, is to write a policy document that will explain how we will work these. And I'm really excited to hear from Eric today, because California has been doing a lot of thinking on this work. But we essentially need to be able to quantify or score these series of measures and align them to the compliance gap that any organization would have for the rule. This is a big focus for us now. If CDOT or an MPO still can't get there after committing to mitigation measures, we did write in some funding restrictions. So this is where some of the teeth of this rule come in. For CDOT, the responsibility we put on us is if we find ourselves in a non-compliance, we need to essentially only program our funding within our 10-year plan on projects that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So if there is a project out there that's in our plan that's actually going to make the situation worse, we can't allocate funding to that. That's the restriction there. For the MPOs, our hook was a couple sources of pass-through dollars, the Surface Transportation Block Grant dollars and CMAQ, two funding sources we pass along. So if an MPO gets in a situation of non-compliance, we will require that those pass-through dollars only go to projects that reduce emissions or fund mitigations. Really important bullet at the end here, we're not taking away funding. This is purely a way to focus resources on projects which we know will move the needle in the direction we want to go. There is a bit of a clause here that helps us if we get into a situation where we really have a critical safety project, and this was a big concern for a lot of stakeholders. You know, as DOTs, a huge part of our mission is to make sure we have a safe system out there. So if we have a critical safety investment to make, that's the best example I can give here. But that project won't necessarily reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have a provision where we can go to our Transportation Commission and ask for a waiver. However, that doesn't mean that we're going to allow a massive highway widening, because we have a provision in there that says that a waiver cannot be granted if it's going to substantially contribute to greenhouse gas emissions, you know, in relation to what our objectives are. So where I'll leave you for today is just sort of our path ahead and some of the work we'll be doing in the coming year and years. I've mentioned a couple times, we do want to help our MPOs build their modeling capability, and our commission just approved a $1 million investment to help them do that. So we'll be working with particularly our more rural organizations to help them. We are in the middle of working on this mitigation policy to quantify these measures, choose which ones that, you know, we have faith in and can quantify, figure out if we want to use a scoring regime, figure out how we can encourage these investments to go in disproportionately impacted communities, because we committed to do that. Figure out how we address the effectiveness timelines, how some things will be more powerful in the early years and lose their effectiveness in terms of greenhouse gases over time, especially as our fleet turns over, compared to other measures like land use and parking, which may not show much of a difference at all for a period of time, but will be really powerful in 2040 and 2050. Those are all the things we're chewing on that I'm excited to hear from Eric. And then our overall requirement, we are to update our plan to be in compliance with this rule by October 1 of 2022. So we're also going through the process of updating our 10-year plan, looking at the projects in there and seeing, and then running that through the model. And then the last slide here is just some links to both the rulemaking and our roadmap. And I will turn it back over to you, Chris. With that, I think we're going to take questions at the end, right?
Yep, thanks, Rebecca. And we also dropped that the link to the standard in the chat box, so folks can just click on it if they want. I've already got some questions for you. So if other folks do, drop them in the question and answer box. I think we're gonna mainly look there for questions so we don't have to keep track of the chat and the Q&A. So look for that Q&A box. With that, we're going to transition over to California. And as you'll hear, whereas Colorado's rule is looking mainly at greenhouse gas budgets, California's rule is geared more towards tracking VMT growth. So they've been thinking about this a little bit longer than Colorado, and Eric's gonna walk us through where things are today.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks to everybody for coming and being interested in this. Everybody see the slide in the correct mode and everything?
It's in, we can still see the sidebar, but.
Well, let's see. How's that?
Perfect.
Awesome. Sorry. A hopefully that was a pause that refreshed everyone. So you can see right off the bat that messaging is still a challenge here with our title. If somebody has a good idea for these sorts of things that doesn't use the words VMT or induced demand or something like that, and is also like shorter than rethinking how we build so Californians can drive less, I would really love it. So drop your ideas in the chat and winners will get free Caltrans swag. So I'm going to go briefly through the background here. And where we are today is focusing not on plans, but on projects. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about where we are on certain projects already in the pipeline and coming along, and then really focus more on implementation issues. Not getting super wonky and detailed, but a little bit about how we figure out how much VMT we're going to get from a project and how we can reduce VMT. So in 2020, we adopted our guidance at Caltrans under CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. It's similar to NEPA, but has a little bit more teeth. And our guidance said that we were going to we used to use level of service under CEQA as the transportation impact. I think most people on this call probably can realize the pitfalls of that. So as an environmental impact, I mean, LOS isn't gone. It's still used in places for, where should we put the driveway and how should we signalize this interchange and that kind of thing. But for environmental impact, we moved to total VMT. And it was not only for climate. Climate was the main driver, but there was a lot of support for doing it out of the equity community because we have lots of neighborhoods that have lots of traffic in them. People driving through a neighborhood to get from one place to another and affecting the quality of life there and the health. I won't read all these things, you can read them. It has a land use component. So while we're working on the state highway system at Caltrans, the local units of government who do zoning and entitlements are looking at VMT from land uses. So this is consistent with the California Air Resources Board GHG scoping plan, which puts an emphasis on the three legs of the stool, but does not forget vehicle miles traveled. I think Chris at his intro already talked about the importance there. And people may be familiar with SB 375, which is CARB has been operating for a long time. I won't go into the details. That still exists. It's more of a planning requirement, similar to what Colorado is doing in some ways. And CARB runs that through the MPO. So what we're doing is on top of it. And part of that is because analysis showed that we were not meeting our climate goals simply through SB 375 and the planning goals that had been in place since 2008. More recently, we have this other climate plan that the administration put out last summer. So we're consistent with that. And our goal, in short, is no induced VMT. We would more broadly want to actually reduce VMT and take steps to implement land use and transportation policies that actually turn VMT back down. But as a regulatory matter right now, we're focusing on induced VMT. And so what do I mean by that? That's VMT attributable to a particular project. So there's already a baseline, there's already a transportation built environment, transportation and land uses out there. There are other factors, gas prices, the economy, on and on that we won't list that will affect how much VMT that we have. So overall, we would like to push all those policy levers, but what I'm going to focus on here is specifically reining in VMT attributable to projects. And so we know that we've been inducing a lot of demand at state DOTs and at other agencies, and what we're trying to do is not do that anymore, in short. So where do we get induced VMT? Well, when we add lane miles or interchanges or other highway capacity, we get these feedback loops. We get route changes, and that could increase or decrease VMT. If it's a shortcut, maybe at least in the short term, people drive less, or at least they have shorter trips. But when we increase access to destinations through auto at the expense of other modes, then people drive more. They make longer trips because in the, at least the short term, we have more auto capacity. It doesn't take as long. Maybe it's more reliable, and maybe we make more trips too. And most insidiously, we start to disperse land use, right? We move land use out to take advantage of that new accessibility that's out, typically on the urban fringe. And that feeds back to the rest, because once the hospital moves out of downtown and out of the transit-oriented section that it's been for 100 years out into the urban fringe, people can't take the bus there anymore. They have to drive further, and they don't trip chain as much. So that's what we're really trying to do, is rein in induced travel. So we have a whole bunch of projects that are already in the works, and a lot of them have widening, hundreds of miles of widening for projects throughout the state. And so first thing that we did was look at all those projects, and the ones that were far enough along that were ready to go to construction just got a pass. There was a so-called concurrence list, and so that's not relevant to this anymore. We have these legacy projects that are relevant, and we're trying to work with them, and it's messy. And then, like on the planning horizon, we have projects that will be coming along. Hopefully that's cleaner because the expectations are there, and we're not sort of imposing these regulations in the middle of the project pipeline. So we have some projects in that legacy project category that we're not concurred on, and we're not brand new, and we're far enough along to already be doing VMT analysis. My office has looked at about 15 of those. We've had a couple that have come into us and started talking about mitigation. We have 2 that are kind of at the end of the process. SR 37 in the Bay Area is a widening that has a draft EIR, and it has a tolling element to try to mitigate VMT. And then SR 59 is a small project in Merced. And I don't want to spike the ball in the end zone yet, so I probably should not have even mentioned where it is, because the ink isn't dry on this yet. But we're trying to offset the additional lane miles in the project with a road diet nearby. So we won't actually calculate the VMT from each one. We'll just look at the total number of lane miles and call it good. Hopefully, fingers crossed. So when we do VMT assessment, that's the first half of the equation here. We have some pretty good tools. We have found that we allow for demand models to be used, but they are problematic. They can be, there's a lot of art and science in the demand model. You could have 2 very well-meaning modelers come up with completely different results, particularly when you get into questions about pricing and things like that. They're a problematic regulatory tool. And I think we found that in SB 375 also, where you would go back and see some of the assumptions made around land use that were, put into the model and wonder, is that realistic or not? But we do have a calculator that works on elasticity for lane miles, and that works pretty well in a lot of cases, except it doesn't work in general. Some of these complications that are coming up, rural areas, we know a lot less about the feedback loops and the rebound effects in the rural areas. Most of the literature is all on urban areas or metro areas. Interchanges are a challenge because there's not lane miles associated. It's just a new interchange, creating new auto accessibility where there wasn't any before. You almost have to go to the model, but the model again depends on what you do with the land use and interact that, which is really difficult. Pricing, come back to that in a second, but debates about whether tolls help us or hurt us, and then minor arterials, kind of like the rural areas. There's not a lot of literature on that. Mostly it's about primary arterials and freeways. So in the pricing, we have an internal debate going on now about tolling. And so you can hypothetically or just theoretically think, if we add a toll, we're adding travel costs, therefore people should travel less. Okay, that's basic, supply demand. So sure, tolling might reduce VMT. On the other hand, if it saves you travel time and uncertainty, and those are worth more than the travel costs that you're paying in dollars, you might induce travel. And we do have some empirical evidence that when we've gone HOV to hot, which is typically in our state how we get tolls, we break up carpools. People who are carpooling will just pay to go through it. And so then we end up with more VMT. So it's complicated. Right now, you have to kind of show your work and make your case. We don't have a really good, smooth way of saying, if you do X, Y, and Z, we'll have this result. So that brings us to the other side of the coin where I wanted to spend a little bit more time, which is on mitigation, or I'm calling it mitigation because that's really, you know, we assume we're going to have a highway project that produces some VMT and then we've got to go mitigate it. That's how CEQA works. But in the bigger picture, it's really VMT reduction. It's ways to reduce VMT. So it could be a standalone project that you want to propose, and you're pitching it to the California Transportation Commission to get funded because it reduces VMT. Then it wouldn't be mitigation. It would just be a project that, if it really worked, would be a potentially good project that should get funded. At any rate, that feeds into this first bullet. The first thing that we want to do is avoid VMT. So does the project have to have as many lane miles? Does it have to be as big as it was originally proposed, or what we conventionally would say? Right sizing it might be the first and best option. What project features can we bring in? Again, we don't have to mitigate if there's already a transit feature in the project that is reducing VMT, then it sort of nets out some of that highway VMT. And there's a thing called bundling, and won't get into that too much, but it's where a project sponsor, a lot of our projects are sponsored at the local level, might be have a program where they have different modes and they could bring those together in the CEQA process and kind of offset them, similar to the project features, even with different projects. But let's say you get through the avoidance phase and you can't do it, or you're far enough along that it's too late and you got to mitigate. So what are you looking at? There are things that we can build on the state highway system, or as a local unit of government building on the local network. You could build bike and ped, you can build transit, that sort of thing. There are cooperative agreements that we can enter into. So with a TDM provider, with a land use developer, et cetera. And what we're hoping to get, and this is not an if, but a when, because there's lots of interest in this because of the cumbersomeness of coming up with this on a project by project basis, is a mitigation bank or exchange where mitigation suppliers, whether it's transit providers or developers of affordable housing, whoever, has a bunch of stuff that's just on the shelf ready to go, or even commodified and funded by the mitigation bank. So you just pay into it and buy your mitigation. That will happen. We have it already in other resource categories, such as wetlands. There's banking for stuff like that. Something called advanced mitigation. So this will happen. But it's a challenge. And however we do it, whether we build it directly, we agreed with somebody that we're going to do it, or this banking exchange thing kicks in, we have these considerations. Whatever is being offered up as mitigation has to meet a few tests. So the first one is additionality. Like if it was going to happen anyway, it shouldn't count. We shouldn't take credit for the existence of art, or that's a little facetious, but stuff that's either already been built or is already funded and is going to be built or done. And the memorandum on the left there is our clarification on that. We had people taking a super hard line saying, if it's in a regional plan, then it's already spoken for and you can't count it. Well, we know that not everything in a regional plan gets built. So we drew the line at, does it have funding? And if it's in an out year in the plan and you bring it forward and give it funding and assure that it happens, then we count it. But if it's already funded, then you can't. There's more nuance to it than that, but that's kind of the essence. Effectiveness, and that's what I'm going to spend more time on in a minute, but you got to show that this is actually going to work, right? You can't just do hand waving and say, we got to, it looks good to me. Commitment, there's got to be a pretty solid MOU or funding plan or something that whatever measure you're going to do is going to happen. In equity, we don't want to pump a bunch more traffic into neighborhood A and go mitigate it in neighborhood B. There's got to be some nexus that the remedy for some of these VMT issues occurs, particularly in distressed areas in proximity to where the injury is occurring. So fortunately, people have thought about this stuff. And here's an SSTI publication from a couple of years ago that looked at how to reduce VMT for various mitigation measures. Here in California, we have a new, even longer title than mine in these slides, handbook that came out in December from a group called CAPCO. It's the Air Pollution Control Association. That's super handy for this. Now, a lot of the discussion about the SSTI and CAPCOA is about land use projects or things that TMAs might do to reduce VMT for an activity center, right? So we can't just cut and paste for Caltrans purposes, but we can borrow and adapt. And so that's what we're doing. Here's a handy part of like a 3-page, 4-page section on residential density out of the CAPCO guide. And it has, they've done the lit review. They're pretty authoritative about the numbers that they're showing. And so key to this is that we expect residential density to be typically about 9.1 dwelling units per acre, and anything less than that would be considered low density, and you shouldn't get any credit for it if you're trying to create high density VMT reduction. We also can see that there's an elasticity that for every percentage point in increased density, you get negative 0.22 percentage points less in VMT. So that's pretty handy. If we then apply those factors to typical household VMT, we can use this formula, which is really straightforward, to create a table that simply says how much VMT less will we get per household in a denser housing development. And it limits it at 30%. You can't go all the way, you can't go to 110%, like there's not negative VMT. So 30% is the reasonable range here. Now, how would we do that? We would provide, if you want to mitigate a project, it could be providing surplus land where we have a lot of, where it could be built. We could provide infrastructure. We could provide funding because we buy a lot of mitigation. So we could buy housing. It's actually been done once in California's history, a long time ago, but it's been done. So that's one example of how we might quantify this based on some of the great literature that's already out there. I'm winding up here, so there will be time for questions. But we're producing something called the Mitigation Playbook that takes that similar approach to a number of different potential measures that people might want to use for mitigation. And we'll summarize them in this chart and then go spend 5 or 10 pages on each one to suggest how you might be able to measure. So land use density I just showed, for at least on the housing side. Affordability is also very powerful. CAPCO gives you almost 30% more for affordable housing because people who have less disposable income don't drive as much. Active transportation is one that we will go to automatically, and that's fine. And we do have complete streets policies. We should be building active transportation regardless of VMT policy. The efficacy low here is that if you add a lane of freeway and then put a bike path next to it, they're not going to equal out. The efficacy level is pretty low in the grand scheme of things as active transportation is normally construed. Now, if you funded a whole county's active transportation plan and built out a network or something with your funding, then we might be talking. But generally, the way we talk about it, you're not going to offset that much VMT with it. TDM, I won't read all of these things, but they'll be in the guide. Telecommuting, we're not, we're pouring at least chilly water on, if not ice cold. Telecommuting, the rebound effects tend to be equal to or greater than the reductions in actual commuting. Could talk about that if people are interested. Schedule shifting is a TDM strategy that's good for shaving the peak, but doesn't do much on VMT. Road diets I covered, pricing I covered. Parking we think is pretty important. So if you can reduce parking at your development that we were discussing before, you get more points for that. And finally, land preservation is something a lot of our stakeholders want to do. It's not clear to me, and maybe it never will be, but I'm open to it, how you measure it. Because you can imagine, I mean, the picture people paint is we're creating a green belt around some area and it'll be great. But you could also do patchwork of land preservation within an area and just disperse stuff even more. So I don't know how you measure it and how you do that. So it's on the list and we're open to hearing about it, but right now we don't have a path forward for folks. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you, Eric. And thanks both of you. We've got some questions coming in. A lot of them tend to be on the more technical side, which means we've got like-minded folks in the crowd. I'd like to start maybe at a higher level. And as I was listening to both of you talk through your programs and sort of contrasting them, maybe I'll start, Eric, with you. Well, so Colorado's rule right now looks at plans and programs, right? So basically the entire bundle of investments and what the outcome of that is. And obviously California, the focus is really at the project level, as you mentioned, Eric. Although, Eric, I hear you talking about like, oh, like we're mitigating this project with this other road project over here, and you're starting to talk about mitigation banks and stuff. So I am wondering how, if you feel like there is some, you're moving towards more of like a bundle approach thinking, and, you know, probably one of the reasons that's more difficult is that there is no statewide model. So you can't really lean on that sort of tool. So you do kind of have to do this onerous project by project tool. But any thoughts on my rambling there, Eric?
Well, SB 375, as I mentioned, still does do the MPO level program, you know, cut, and they still have to meet their targets. But, you know, it's just not getting us there. So yes, I think what CEQA allows for something called tiering, where you could have a plan and tier off it. All the projects under it would get kind of a pass. It's a pretty technical, substantial technical challenge to do that on VMT that we haven't cracked yet. But we know that the bigger MPOs are interested in trying to do that. And so we may kind of meet in the middle where 743, which is project by project, kind of grows into more of a programmatic approach, whereas we have we already have the 740 or the 375 stuff.
Yeah, just so folks know, there will be a recording of this. I've got questions about that. So now to turn things to you, Rebecca, you're one of the only states that has a model, and probably the only one that has an activity-based model, right? So this is an advantage that you have in actually looking at your entire programs that way. I am wondering though, as you mentioned, like you're seeing gaps and hoping to, you know, there's tools that Eric was talking about that can fill some of your needs. Can you talk a little bit more about that for a second?
Yeah, I do feel we're at an advantage. It took us about 5 years to build the model here without even having a standard like this in sight, but just felt it would be a really good tool to have within the department because we rely on these models to figure out the impacts of our projects and often end up asking consultants to do that work. So we do feel like we're in a good spot, and we actually built our model largely after what our major MPO had built, the Denver Regional Council of Governments. I saw a question in the chat just about that, and it's important to note it actually takes two different models, right? Our travel demand model will give us the total VMT that is expected from all those projects within our plan. We then have to run that through moves, the EPA model, to figure out what the carbon emissions are. And we're actually trying to build now that capability at CDOT, because in the past, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment has been the only agency to run moves, and they do that for air quality conformity. But also it's an opportunity, especially as we look at the increasing numbers of electric vehicles in Colorado. We actually hit, I think, 13% of sales in December. We can tailor moves to capture what actually the fleet is out there, which is really great. So we'll know exactly sort of what is happening. So to your question, Chris, yeah, not all the MPOs are at this level. I think the conversation we need to have is, are they willing to use CDOT's model, and we'll kind of snip off the portion we need for a certain MPO area, or do they want to build that capability in-house? And that's why I was happy to get the success with our commission to provide some funding to help them do that, whether they want to use a consultant or build a more in-house staff. But it's going to take a few years, which is part of the reason we have have aligned the reduction standards with different time periods depending on the MPO. So I'm hopeful we'll get there. The other piece that we're developing is what makes good modeling. I mean, that's one of the things we're all going to have to agree on among our 6 agencies. What assumptions are we making? What sort of level of sophistication do we want to see that we can then trust? And that's also a difficult document to write, to make sure that we're all on the same page over what we agree is the right level of technical sophistication.
I've got a follow-up question for that then. So obviously, like the first time you go through this, you've got targets, 5 years or whatever. The first time you go through this makes sense, right? You have a target that you're looking at, and you're gonna see where you're falling. How does that play out year after year? Like, are you tracking whether I guess in theory you're meeting the target every year, right? But how do you adjust, as from year to year? Is it, changes to modeling, looking back at past project performance and adjusting targets? What does that look like?
Yeah, I guess there's a couple questions in there. One being an important part of the way this role is structured is we have to meet this standard every time a new plan is adopted. So for CDOT, we're typically on a 4-year cycle. So we'll demonstrate compliance at this October 1 of 2022. Then we'll update our plan in another 4 years. We're sort of on that federal cycle and figure out whether we can still meet it with the new plan in place then. That is the same structure we've used for the MPOs. And we had a lot of discussions about amendments and all that, but the way the whole thing is structured is you show compliance with the standard at the time you adopt a new plan. Maybe part of what you're also asking though is, how do you know kind of in that interim period if you're headed in the right direction, right? This is all projection, it's all based on modeling in the future. We don't really know. That was quite important to our stakeholders, particularly when you look at 1261 and those targets. How can we ensure that transportation is getting us there? So we did write in a requirement, and I'm trying to remember now, I think it's every 3 years, we will do a report on greenhouse gas emission reductions in transportation and sort of provide that open book on, all right, here's where we're projecting we're headed. Here's what we're seeing out there now based on VMT and the vehicle fleet. So there's a little bit of a feedback loop in terms of we're not all just looking at a hoped for future, but have some sense of what's happening in there.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. I can throw a little more technical question to Eric. I mentioned the road diet project that you were thinking of as a mitigation. What's like, how are you thinking about how close that project has to be to another project to count,
Yeah, this one happened to be close enough that it didn't, no reasonable person would have objected. So we didn't have to come up with a rule that it had to be within a certain distance. We did have to come up with a rule that it had to be a similar facility. So you couldn't take a small road and road diet and call it good against a freeway. But these were both similar minor arterials within maybe not walking distance, but a bike ride distance. But I don't, so that gets to so in theory, there's not really, if we're trying to do carbon, we don't really care, right? It could be anywhere. It could be in another state. We really wouldn't care. It's more of a question about equity and are we going to inundate one neighborhood with traffic and benefit another, as I mentioned. So if that would just be the test, not like, is it 2 miles away or 5 miles away?
Thanks. We've got a couple questions in here about telework and telecommuting. I'll give a little perspective on that and then turn it over. I think if you were just creating like a telework program as an employer, and you knew that the only change would be that folks are working from home a few days a week and not really changing anything else, you could imagine that lowering VMT emissions. But what a lot of the literature that we're seeing is showing that implementing really concrete long-term telework policies can actually have an unintended consequence of letting folks live further and further away, because it's not as much of a pain to drive into work, and then they end up living in sort of far-flung areas where they're driving a lot more for other stuff. How are either of you thinking about telework?
As I mentioned, that's one of the big objections. Is we've got. I can tell you, coming to Sacramento last year in the COVID and trying to find a house, I was competing with people from the Bay Area, all moving out of the Bay Area and away from transit and into further from work. So when they do go to work, they end up driving further, not using transit. And even if people stay put, you end up seeing a lot more home-based trips popping up. So you see where you might have trip chained on the way to work to pick up groceries or something. Now you're making a specific trip. And even if that doesn't, maybe that doesn't quite equal out because commute trips tend to be longer. In the net and overall, the literature suggests that the rebound effects are pretty significant, and there's definitely not a slam dunk that it reduces VMT. The question is is it equal or greater?
Anything to add, Rebecca, or is that where you're falling to?
Yeah, and we definitely played with some scenarios when we were looking at the standard that really assumed some pretty high work from home, and saw a benefit there within the modeling. But we're also struggling with some of these same issues, that the trip chaining, and in Colorado, we just saw through COVID, it was a good opportunity for a lot of people to relocate to Aspen or Steamboat because where you work didn't matter so much anymore. So it is a double-edged sword. We've even seen here, I think a lot of states are in the same boat, even though there's a lot of people still working from home in Colorado. Most of the Colorado Department of Transportation is still at home. Our VMT numbers are back up to where they were pre-COVID, and in some cases even a little higher on some corridors. So it's not the panacea that I think all could have hoped it would be.
Yep. I think we've actually at least hit on most of the questions, either talking or hope answering some of the folks in the chat. So I do want to respect folks' time and wrap things up. I have a million more questions to ask, but that's why we'll have some follow-up workshops and webinars. So thanks to everyone for joining us today. If anyone out there is interested in working, DOT folks out there interested in working with us and with some of these other folks, reach out to me directly. If you want to find out about future webinars and events like this, check us out at ssti.us and sign up for the newsletter so you'll get updates on that stuff. And with that, I think just once again, thank you, and looking forward to seeing everyone again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.